there probably is a little bit of apprehension there with farmers. It's been kind of a moving target, since the beginning of the year. But now they're kind of saying, well, whatever, and then, of course, the current administration has pretty strong support from the farmer base, so they're feeling, fairly confident that they'll be taken care of, if incomes are hurt, if you like, just like they were before, several years ago.
With most of the agronomy work now completed on cereal crops, attention is firmly shifted to their yield potential and, of course, the outlook for the harvest price. Ireland's harvest is relatively small compared to other nations, and as a country that imports between 4 to 5 million tonnes of grain annually, we remain heavily influenced by international markets. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We'd really appreciate it if you could listen, follow, and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. Grain prices are driven in the short term by sentiment and speculation, but are ultimately grounded in real supply and demand. The United States plays a major role in global grain markets, which in turn influences our own harvest. So today I'm delighted again to be joined by Brian Caldbeck, who runs a seed business in Kentucky, to discuss how US farmers are managing this year. Brian, can you tell us how is the 2025 season shaping up so far in Kentucky?
Well, Michael, we had a fairly dry winter and early spring, probably up to April, and then the tap turned on, and it's really been fairly wet, since then. One weekend there in April we had 250 millimeters of rain in a couple of days, and then it's kind of been, every few days it dries up a little bit, and then by the time you think it's ready to go and you get something done, it's back to the rain again. And so we're kind of a little bit behind on some of the plantings, and for time of the year, we're probably, I think, on corn, I think we're 72% planted in Kentucky versus a 5-year average of 82, so dragging a little bit on that. And beans kind of the same, although, a lot of the beans, of course, we're not really late for beans yet, so, we can plant beans for, probably the whole way through June. So, but yeah, so it's got a little bit wet, and of course, that's getting into the wheat harvest as well, which is just about starting now, and all the rest. And in the southern US, a lot of that wet weather is not good this time of the year for wheat, and, from the point of view of diseases and all the rest, that goes with wet weather at harvest. So,
Almost sounds very like our spring last year. It took an awful long time for it to get going, but then when it eventually did get going, it dried up. But just thinking about maize, Brian, maybe maize over here is slightly different than you have it over there, but maize doesn't particularly like all that wet conditions in the early stages of growing either, I'd say, does it?
no, not really. I mean, it's warm, relatively warm there, so that kind of helps it a little bit. But yeah, it'll be looking kind of yellow and miserable looking, with all that water on it, and then there's slugs and things appears on it and different things. But yeah, it's not the biggest fan of the wet feet, But but getting into the field is usually the biggest thing, and some of the times the fields get planted and get flooded over the top, and then that's a replant job there right away.
And for the likes of maize in your area in Kentucky, what's the kind of if you like, the cutoff stage for a reasonable yield in terms of time of year for planting?
Well, I know on our farm last year we planted on the 29th of May, which is not too long ago. It's only a few days ago
Sure.
now, and we still had I would say above average crop, but that's still, you're definitely pushing it there at that point. If the weather goes wrong in July and it dries up, that late planting with no much roots developed on it, that can get you into trouble. So you just don't know. It's kind of a dice roll when you're planting that late. It's kind of like planting late spring barley in Ireland. It could be really good or it could be worthless.
Sure, sure. And
So,
there's no fear some of that later stuff would end up in the really hot part of the year, which could affect that whole fertilization and that.
oh, for sure, yeah, we could hit the wrong time there, pollination, and mess it up there with no water and hard clay soils and 100 degrees, 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and then you're in trouble for sure, yeah. But
Sure. Okay.
you never know. I mean, it could be cool in July, it could be cool in August. You just never know with this weather.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And just in terms of I suppose, rolling from one year to the next and given maybe the overhang from last year, potentially looking forward to this year. Is there any shifts at all in terms of acreage of the various different crops planted, or are people sticking pretty much with what they were accustomed to doing year on year?
Usually, usually rotation is king. People don't like to start, going back on the same ground with the same crop every year. So rotation usually calls it, but I would say there probably was a little bit of a shift towards higher maize acres this year. Based on, the soybean export market maybe didn't look too hot there at one point in the spring. And so there was probably a little bit of a shift towards maize or corn, but now all this wet weather in the south has probably, knocked that away, and
Sure.
we're back into planting, maybe more beans now, just because we got delayed with the maize.
That's the final option kind of thing. And go
Yeah.
back to what we talked about before, because I know you were very big into oilseed rape and you set a good bit of oilseed rape seed.
Uh-huh.
How much of an increase have you seen, or have you seen a decent increase in that from the point of view of not just the area, but do people see an advantage in that in terms of their overall rotation and some of those resistant weeds that are building up in, which is not just in, I'm sure in America, but certainly in Ireland as well, around some of that. The specific resistance around GM maize and some of the soya, GM soya and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, depends where you are, I mean, in the areas that are more where winter wheat is more prevalent, or small grains or cereals are more prevalent, the all-seed rape definitely is favored, to be included in the rotations by farmers, just because of getting on top of some of these grass weeds that can be quite tough in the wheat, and to kill.
Sure.
And then, most people, they usually, compared to growing, a lot of small grains in a rotation, when they put in a crop of oilseed rape, they usually see a pretty good jump, in the wheat yield the following year. As you could
Mm,
see maybe 15 to 25% jump in the wheat yield the following year with much the same inputs. So yeah, people like that, um, but the oilseed rape, it's always depends on that market. And the US, there's, some processors will process it, and sometimes they're a bit far away, from where you're growing it, and then
okay.
it's a logistical game. So, but the farmers do like it if they can get a decent price for it, and a good outlet for it. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned there, it just tweaked my interest when you mentioned there are areas where small grains predominate mostly. The oilseed rape is part of that. Why is there some areas of the area United States that have small grains predominate over maybe maize or that? What's the predominant factor behind that?
Most of it is, timely rainfalls. Some of these areas where small grains predominate, they get decent rainfall over the winter months, and it's cooler. And but then in the summer, the tap turns off in June, and then you don't really have enough of, you need
Okay,
probably a good solid 15 to 20 inches of water to grow a crop of maize, and all the rest. So it kind of knocks it out in some of those areas, because they may only get 5 or 6 inches of water over the
okay.
summer months, and whereas the winter wheat, it's used that winter moisture in a cooler time of the year, and it gets done, before that really stressful weather comes in. So that's kind of been most of the reason for that.
Just with the year that's in it, Brian, in terms of cost are up, I suppose they are this year the same as most other years with fertilizer and grain hasn't exactly jumped out of its skin. It's probably gone backwards, probably more so since the start of the year. How are farmers going to adjust in terms of their input costs, or will they adjust at all? Will they just kind of, it's a continuing gamble and keep going the way we're going?
So I would say everybody's probably cut back a little bit. Some of the bells and whistles, if you like, in the production programs have got cut out. You're basically looking at the base inputs, if you like, the seed costs. Of course, farmers are shopping around for seeds, maybe looking at some of the less pricier seed options. Definitely not overdoing it on the fertilizer, and that sort of a thing. And the so I would say basically, they're not running their crops short, really
Mm,
by any means, but they're not going over the top either with any of the fancy stuff, if you like. And the biological there's a lot of people trying to sell biologicals at the minute, and to enhance the soil's ability to supply nutrients to crops, and it's kind of a that's a pretty unknown sort of an area yet, if you like. There's a
Sure.
lot of different products on the market, and farmers are trying this, that, and the other, and seeing, are any of these making sense and all the rest. So there's a lot of that going on, for sure, trying to, make more with less, if you like. But again, that whole area is it's kind of new, and hasn't really been researched to a great degree.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, it's kind of similar over here, I suppose, as well. There's lots of various different products on the market, and there's very little science behind it really when it's all said and done.
Hmm.
If we look a little bit wider, maybe from the national position, and certainly with your networks, you probably have a fairly decent view on this. How about the US crop in a general sense? Is it up to date? Is it specific areas have maybe different type of stresses on them at the moment?
So nationally on corn, I think they're up to last week they were 81% done versus 85% 5-year average. And soybeans were 66% done versus 68% 5-year average. So not a terrible trail behind, but it is a little bit behind the 5-year average, yes.
There was a big trend there I seen, Brian, that wheat, I think the plantings of wheat are nearly at the lowest level in, was it 50 years or 80 years? I think I seen some headline there somewhere. Right? The wheat plantings are very low this year.
Most American farmers, when you ask them about wheat, they'll tell you, well, there's somebody harvesting wheat somewhere in the world every day of the year. So, we really don't, you know, we we don't have a product that nobody else can grow. Lots of places in the world can grow wheat, and it's a pretty round year supply, if you like. So a lot of them don't get too excited about it then. And unless that wheat gets up there, heading up 250, $300 a ton, into that range or above it, they don't get too excited about wheat. And then they'll stick with their with their raw crops. But again, the traditional wheat areas, they don't have that option, so they will plant wheat. But the areas where wheat can be planted opportunistically, those guys won't bother with it, unless it's a really good price, because a lot of them are not really well set up to plant it. They don't really have the equipment or and all the rest, and it has to pencil out pretty good on the paper before they'll bother with it.
And from that point of view, as you did mention, the rest of the world can grow wheat, and the American farmer probably does export a lot of their produce one with the other. And was the market signals you mentioned already a little bit about the soya, but was there other driving factors in terms of that global market signals around that influenced the planting decisions at the moment?
Not really. I mean, really, the export numbers, you'll hear this, that, and the other about it, but really, the export numbers and everything, it kind of, held up fairly well to expectations. And I think, customers for US ag commodities all over the world, obviously they're going to shop around and buy where they can and diversify their purchase base, if you like, in case somebody has a bad crop or whatever, or for some political reasons or whatever's going on. But most of the export numbers remain pretty solid, and continue to remain pretty solid. And I think just consumers all over the world, they know they need to have several options where to buy their food supplies, if you like. So I think they just keep the door open everywhere.
Okay. And I suppose just talking about that in terms of exports, obviously we can't talk about that without talking about some of the tariffs that are, I don't know, what do we call them, being imposed or being proposed. I'm not really sure which, because there's kind of it's a mix and gathering in terms of what's being announced one week with another. Is this driving a bit of nervousness in terms of farmer sentiment, in terms of where their crop is going to go or where it's going to end up at the end of the season?
Yeah, I think it's driving some. There probably is a little bit of apprehension there with farmers, about a lot of that. It's been kind of a moving target, since the beginning of the year. Tariffs are proposed and then they're suspended or delayed for a few months. So it's kind of been back and forth, and there's nearly, I think people are kind of just they've kind of gone immune to listening about it now at the moment, or just
Sure.
whatever, continuing on and whatever it is, it is. But because of, it's been kind of back and forth on the different scenarios, and yeah, in the beginning everybody was kind of worried about stuff, but now they're kind of saying, well, whatever, and then of course, the current administration has pretty strong support from the farmer base,
Mm.
so they're feeling, fairly confident that they'll be taken care of, if incomes are hurt, if you like, just like they were before, several years ago. If incomes come under pressure, or whatever, they feel they'll, be helped out, if that occurs.
Okay, still be on the right side of it. I suppose the other one, maybe Brian, isn't it? We heard an awful lot about this Doge in terms of their cuts to, some of the federal programs and that kind of stuff. Was there much in terms of cuts towards? So if I was a farmer, I suppose put it this way, if I'm a farmer, in Kentucky or somewhere or other, do I see much of a difference in terms of the supports I'm getting from, the state employees or state assistants or whatever from towards the kind of farming public?
I would say the core elements of that really haven't been touched, but some of the maybe less essential parts of it have come under a little bit of pressure, which probably is not a bad thing. Um, but the core elements of it appear to be holding up pretty good, and I think you know whoever's looking at all that and understands the importance of a strong agricultural community and all the rest, and I think they're hopefully going to. I mean, the objective, I imagine, is to maybe not so much take out the budget, if you like, but reallocate it and maybe, put it where it maybe can do, or be of more value, to everybody.
As you're talking to people, what's the sense that you get from the agricultural community in terms of where they would like to see those policies land, I suppose, in terms of, we're not going to change so much anymore. Here's what we're going to do, and away we go.
I would say research, research, research. We don't need that to be cut, if you like. However, I would say a lot of people will say, a lot of farmers will say, hopefully we can get a little bit more balance in the people that are reviewing these research projects, and that the projects that receive the financial awards, if you like, are better geared towards commercial reality instead of some pie in the sky stuff. And they're looking for a better balance, if you like, on the research, and research that matters, if you like, ultimately for farmers. And then, another thing farmers are saying, hopefully can we, kickstart fertilizer manufacturing, become less dependent on bringing it in from overseas, and the same on pesticides and all that. They're quite reliant on bringing stuff in from overseas. It's some of those key ingredients, to make crops every year. And so that's a lot of the sentiments, that farmers are talking about now, becoming more, independent of having to bring all that stuff in, those imports.
So as you say, there's a strong support from the American farmer for the administration, and that whole, I suppose, thing was all very much geared. The administration's very much geared around self-reliance, more self-reliance in the whole system.
Yeah, I would say that because, so many rural communities in the US have been decimated over the last 30 to 40 years with jobs going overseas, that, there's places where the schools don't run anymore, they're not open, and people have no jobs and things like that. So, there's a strong support out in those communities, to get jobs back in there and get, stuff, materials made in the US again, if you like, compared to being made overseas.
Listen, Brian, it's very interesting as always. You're certainly at the heart of all that, and it's as you say, sometimes it's by listening to you, it's people are listening in for a little while. They're hoping for the best on it, and look, and we'll certainly hope and wish you the best for the rest of the season, and hopefully we'll catch up with you maybe somewhere around harvest or before that in the States. Thanks very much again, Brian.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for your time.
So that's it for this week, and my thanks to Brian for joining me on the podcast. A date for everybody's diary is June the 25th, when Teagasc hosts its Crop and Technology Open Day at Oak Park, Carlow. Highlights include 50 crop research demonstrations showcasing ongoing research, as well as practical sessions on weed control in horticulture and sprayer operations in the central area. There's something for everybody at the Open Day, and everyone is welcome and entry is free. And finally, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review, and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.